just as free. Free as whenever.
Every summer since I was born, I've been dragged to the most beautiful place on earth. My mom's parents took her to the most dramatic part of Wyoming every August growing up, and she continued the tradition with me and my sisters. I say dragged because as a kid, I didn't get just how stunning Grand Teton National Park is. I'd always been the type of kid who would shut the lights off and try to cram in as much TV time into my summer hours as possible. Sure, I'd enjoy getting a cool shirt as a souvenir from our annual trip to the mountains, but I'd be even more glad to be on my way back to the stash of video games I had to leave behind at home. Eventually, my mom got fed up with my complaints about how the long, drawn-out hikes couldn't possibly compare to the comfort of my own home. She, being the brilliant woman she is, decided she would do what my grandparents did to her: send me with a guide into the mountains. A trial by fire to do some climbing, in hopes I would finally appreciate the stunning peaks that inspired hundreds of thousands of people. Initially, this idea gave me that uncomfortable, I don't want to feeling. But my first trip into the mountains far exceeded my expectations. While getting ready for my first route, my guide told me, "You'll absolutely crush it." I guess I was a natural, because as I scampered up my first wall, I fell in love. Not just in love with climbing, but everything that came with it. I fell in love with the challenge, the hard work, and of course the views. But most of all, I fell in love with peace I found inside myself when I was scaling a wall. With that, a dream was born. Not only did I now love being out in the national park, I wanted to climb the tallest mountain around, known as the Grand Teton. After my first trip, my entire life began revolving around the sport of climbing. Every summer for the next 9 years was filled with climbing trips back to the Tetons. One by one, I scaled the peaks surrounding the Grand Teton and my confidence grew. Back at home during the school year, I'd work with weights to improve my strength and practice every route I could in the not-so-rocky North Texas hills. As my skills slowly improved, I started to push my dad for the money to go on the trip to climb the Grand Teton. When my dad finally told me he would pay for the trip, I was mind blown. It's the kind of thing I just never expected to happen. My dad hadn't been overly supportive of me engaging in such a dangerous sport, but recognizing that it was a dream I would chase for the rest of my life, regardless of what he thought, he bit the bullet and decided to give me the help I needed. A week later, I boarded the plane for the trip I'd been dreaming of for almost a decade. Flying into the national park, I get a view of the mountains that's a glimpse of heaven itself. The descent upon the landing is always one of the best parts because I can see how breathtaking the mountains are. When I got off the plane in Jackson Hole, everyone around me was buzzing about the beauty of the mountains. Thinking that I was about to scale the biggest of them all, an almost 14,000-foot peak, gave me a pretty high and mighty feeling. They could talk all they wanted about how stunning and gigantic the peak was from the ground, but I was going up it. Watching my older sister pull up to the airport to pick me up was awesome, because I only get to see her a few times a year. She had moved to the park 4 years prior to capture her longtime dream of working for Grand Teton Lodging Company. It's always really cool to bond with her over our shared love for this special place. As she got out of her car, I turned into a 5-year-old who was getting exactly what he wanted for Christmas, dashing up to her for a huge hug. The next 2 days were all about preparing for the climb. As my sister and I went to mountaineering shops seeking out high-energy foods and extra water-resistant clothing, the excitement built up to an excruciating point. The day before I embarked, I was advised to rest up. But I couldn't sit still. I spent the entire day pacing and staring at the jagged peak. That night, sleep came at a premium, leaving me with a stressed feeling like when I didn't do a really important assignment. As I finally settled into sleep, my alarm blared an emergency tone that could send confused fear into Hitler himself. My awareness was replaced with sheer excitement and focus. I was ready to have the feeling of cool, crisp rock on my hands, working my way up a vertical wall. The short drive to the guide hut felt about 20,000 times longer than it actually was. To pass the time, I looked at the shorter peaks, ticking off whether I'd climbed them, remembering what I had done right and wrong on the trips before. I felt giddy with anticipation of having some exposure under my feet. Climbers will tell you that the feeling of having nothing but you and a vertical wall to scale is just magic. It gives a sense of being free that can't be brought on by anything else. All the excitement may have gone a little to my head. I was definitely feeling a little cocky. Finally, I arrived at the lot for the hut. Standing there was one of the most intimidating men I'd ever seen. As I got out of the car, I heard him scream with a booming voice in my direction, asking if I was Preston. I very timidly introduced myself to the 6'6" bearded monster. He greeted my sister and me, followed with a nonchalant, "My name's Pat, let's go." He turned around, obviously expecting me to hightail it after him. I gave my sister a goodbye hug and took off for the adventure of a lifetime. About 18 of the 24 hours allotted to ascend are just hiking versus actually climbing. To my surprise, this ended up being the toughest part. The confidence I gained on so many climbs before quickly disappeared, due to the quick gains of elevation that zapped every ounce of energy I had. Pat was a powerhouse, while I, for a mountaineer, was pretty out of shape. After only an hour, I was exhausted. Maybe I'm not the cool cat I thought I was. I began to learn a lot about myself. Having someone like Pat who's so good at what he does right by my side really began to humble me. I wasn't as tough as I originally thought. This realization also stung, but it motivated me to push my limits. After about 10 hours of miserable, beautiful, awful, and amazing hiking with views of the surrounding mountains that appeared as gray, rocky knives firing out of the ground and wildlife in every direction, we got to our camp. At 10,000 feet, an unacclimated person does not sleep, they rest. I was no exception. Weirdly, I felt extremely fresh and ready to climb when Pat awoke me at the pre-dawn hour of 4:30 a.m. This was partly due to my body recovering from the grind of hiking, but mostly for me visualizing just standing on top of that mountain. I piled out of my tent, put on my summit gear and bag, and started the actual rock climbing, working my way up the massive walls that made up the mountain, only knowing where to go because of the light from my headlamp. The experience was at once awe-inspiring, but a little bit frightening to look down and have absolutely no idea what's below me. I proceeded up several pitches of sheer granite, then rested to watch the sunrise. The colorful view could bring tears into the burliest of men. For the first time since the trip started, I began to recover some confidence. This was a new feeling, brought on something that seemed to be given to me straight from the mountain itself. After the sun rose, I had to keep climbing. As I worked my way up, this peaceful feeling expanded, making me feel more calm and tranquil than I ever had. Inch by inch, I worked my way up to the peak, foothold by foothold, handhold by handhold, until I reached the summit. Coming over that final ledge to see everything within 1,000 miles was so rewarding. I was taken over by a calm happiness. I looked around at the many peaks below, the 300-foot deep Jackson Lake, all minuscule, to where I had the honor of standing. But the feeling of summiting was the opposite of what I expected. It wasn't just a really cool thing to check off my bucket list. It turned out to be a feat that was way more difficult than I'd thought. Scaling that mountain was a life-changing experience. I now possess more patience than I ever had. I understood that sticking with a task could get me where I need to be, as long as I never quit working towards my goals. I'm no longer that kid whose skin never feels the warmth of the sun. Now I'm a boy on the brink of becoming a man with an incredible memory of that overwhelming, thankful feeling flooding me. Today I'm thankful I was dragged to the most beautiful place on earth.